The sound of silence was heavier than any explosion. The human woke in the darkness with a sharp pain in his ribs and dust filling his throat. His eyes opened slowly, searching for light, but the only thing he could see was the faint red glow of an emergency panel on the far wall. The air was thick, heavy, and tasted of iron and smoke. He tried to sit up, groaning as his body resisted, and only then did he remember where he was. The bunker. The last place he had run to before the bombardment struck the surface above. He pushed himself to a sitting position, his hands brushing over the cold concrete floor. The walls were cracked, and he could hear faint groans of metal from somewhere in the structure. The bunker had survived, but it was clear it had taken damage. He coughed hard, the sound echoing in the stillness, and that was when he froze. There was another sound. A weak, uneven breath. His heart began to race. He reached for his sidearm, only to find it missing. His pack was gone too. Everything he had carried must have been torn away when the blast had thrown him down here. He pressed his palm to the wall and slowly rose to his feet, ignoring the dizziness that swam through his head. He moved toward the sound, careful, cautious. Each step sending a crunch of debris under his boots. At first, he thought it was another soldier. Maybe one of his unit had made it. But when his eyes adjusted to the faint red glow, he saw a shape curled in the corner. It was not human. The figure was slender, skin pale with a faint shimmer to it, like moonlight caught in motion. The head turned slightly, and he caught the reflection of strange, bright eyes. Not his people. Not his kind. The alien girl was injured. He could see the dark stains on her clothing, the shallow rise and fall of her chest, the way one of her arms bent unnaturally. She was alive but weak. His first instinct was fear. His second was anger. What was she doing here in a human bunker? Was she part of the enemy force that had driven his squad into the ground above? He clenched his fists, his throat dry, torn. Between the urge to finish what the war had started and the gnawing knowledge that he was as helpless as she was, the silence stretched between them until she made a faint sound, a murmur that was not quite words. She tried to push herself up, but her body gave out, and she collapsed back against the wall. He took a step closer before he even realized he was moving. He did not understand her language, but weakness was the same in every species. She was dying. He searched the bunker for supplies, his movements growing more frantic when he found the water filters smashed, the food stores ruined by the collapse. The rations that had been sealed in boxes were now crushed into powder or scattered beneath slabs of stone. He found only a few mouthfuls of stale water in a cracked container. He drank one, then paused, staring back at her. Against every instinct, he crouched and held the rest toward her lips. For a moment she did not react, as if she did not trust him. Then her lips parted, and she swallowed with visible effort. The sound of her drinking was loud in the heavy air. When she finished, her strange eyes lifted to his, and he felt something stir in his chest. It was not trust, not yet, but it was recognition. They were both prisoners of the same ruin. Hours passed in the bunker, though time was difficult to measure without sunlight. The emergency panel flickered sometimes, and he began to fear it would die completely, leaving them in absolute darkness. His stomach twisted with hunger, his lips cracked from thirst. He leaned back against the wall, his body screaming for rest, but his mind refusing to let him close his eyes for long. Every breath reminded him how limited the air was. The filters in the bunker were working only halfway, he could tell. It would not last forever. When he finally drifted close to sleep, a sound woke him. A soft sound, almost like humming. He turned his head and saw her watching him. The alien girl's voice was low, broken, but she was speaking in her language, words he did not know. Yet he understood the meaning behind her tone. She was afraid. She was trying to tell him something. He gestured at himself and then at her, shaking his head, trying to say he could not understand. She looked frustrated, her brows furrowing, then pressed her hand to her chest and said a word. He repeated it clumsily. A faint smile touched her lips, the first he had seen. She pointed at him, waiting. He hesitated, then spoke his own name. She tried to say it, stumbling, but he nodded anyway. It was the first fragile bridge between them. Later, when he grew weaker and his body trembled from lack of food, she seemed to sense his state. She shifted painfully closer, her arms still bent. Wrong, but her movements determined. She touched his arm lightly, then gestured at herself, then to him again, as if offering something. He frowned, not understanding, until she made a gesture toward her own body that left him stunned. His mind rejected the thought at first, confusion mixing with disbelief, but her expression was serious. She was not playing a trick, not mocking. She was showing him her species' way of survival. He pulled back, shaking his head, but her eyes did not waver. They held the weight of someone who knew death was close, and who also knew the only chance left to them. He felt heat in his face, shame burning through him, but also a cruel reminder of his hunger and his weakening state. His body wanted to live, and she was offering life. The bunker groaned again, dust falling from the ceiling, the sound of distant rumbling echoing like thunder from above. He realized then that no one was coming soon. No rescue, no squad, no command. Just the two of them, locked in this tomb of concrete and steel, waiting to see who would break first. As the air grew colder, he watched her lean back, her breathing shallow. The human wrapped his arms around his knees, staring at her across the dim red light. He hated her for being the enemy. He hated himself for depending on her. But beneath all of it, he felt the pull of something deeper, something that whispered survival was not about hate. Survival was about choice, and the choice was coming closer. With every passing breath, the human woke again to the sound of dripping water somewhere deep in the bunker. Though when he searched for the source, he found nothing but wet streaks on the walls. His head pounded from thirst, and his body ached as if every muscle had been pulled too tight. Across the dim glow of the room, the alien girl was still lying against the wall, her eyes half closed, her breaths shallow but steady. He studied her, in the silence, wondering why fate had locked him in this broken shell of a bunker with her, of all beings. When he tried to stand, his legs nearly gave out beneath him. Hunger twisted his stomach until he thought he might vomit, though he had nothing inside him to lose. He pressed his hands against the wall to steady himself and forced his mind to stay clear. The filters were failing, the food was gone, and the only water had been a few desperate mouthfuls. Every instinct told him this was the end. Yet when he looked back at her, he saw something different. Her eyes were open now, watching him with a quiet intensity. She lifted her good hand slowly and pointed toward him, then to her own chest, repeating the gesture from before. He felt heat rush through him at the memory of what she had tried to offer. His pride resisted, his mind screamed against it, but his body knew the truth. If he refused, he would die here in this darkness, nameless and forgotten. She must have seen the storm inside him, because her expression softened, and she tilted her head, as though urging him to see reason. He crouched near her, his movements stiff and awkward. She made another sound, a soft word that seemed like reassurance. Her voice was low and rough, but it carried no threat. He watched as she pressed her own trembling hand to her chest again, and he realized she was offering not out of cruelty or domination, but out of survival, a ritual her kind must have depended on for generations. His heart pounded, his throat dry as sand. The first attempt was clumsy, filled with shame and hesitation. Yet when the taste of her strange milk touched his tongue, he knew instantly this was different from anything he had expected. It was warm, thick, carrying a strength that flowed into his starved body like fire to cold embers. The hunger inside him eased, the dizziness softened, and he could almost feel life returning to his veins. He pulled back quickly, wiping his mouth, unable to meet her gaze. But when he dared to look, she was not mocking him, not angry. She was simply tired, her head lowering back against the wall, her chest rising and falling with effort. Guilt stabbed through him then. She was giving him her strength, draining herself so that he might live. The thought unsettled him deeply. He wanted to protest, to push her away, but when he opened his mouth, only a broken whisper came out. His throat was too raw, his language useless to her ears. So instead he stayed near, watching her, making sure her breaths did not falter. Hours stretched on, heavy and slow. He began to notice small things about her, details his fear had ignored before. The faint shimmer of her skin was not just strange but beautiful in the half-light, like the surface of water when moonlight touched. Her eyes, though alien in shape, carried something familiar, something almost human in the way they followed him, questioning, judging, yet never cruel. She was fragile but unyielding, hurt yet still offering. He realized then that she was no simple enemy. She was something more, something he did not yet understand. The silence between them grew less sharp with time. He found himself trying small gestures to speak, pointing at objects, naming them in his own tongue, hoping she would understand. At first she only watched, confused, but soon she began to mimic his words, repeating them in her accented voice. When she pointed at the cracked ceiling and whispered the sound he had made earlier, he felt the faintest spark of connection. It was not language, not yet, but it was a bridge. Still, fear remained. Every groan of the bunker reminded him that death might fall on them at any moment. The walls had shifted during the last tremor, and dust fell in soft streams from the ceiling whenever the earth rumbled above. He wondered if the enemy still roamed the surface, if anyone from his squad had survived, if rescue would ever come. The chances felt thinner than the air that pressed against his lungs. At one point he tried to force open the heavy door, straining until his muscles shook, but it was jammed solid. The alien girl watched him, her expression unreadable, before she whispered something that sounded like a warning. She tapped her ear, then the ground, and he realized she meant the noise might draw attention. He gave up reluctantly, sweat running down his back. She was right. If the enemy was outside, noise would betray them both. As night or day passed, he no longer knew which his reliance on her grew. Each time his strength began to fade, she would offer again, her face calm though her body weakened. He hated himself for taking, yet he could not deny the change in him. His limbs steadied, his mind sharpened, and with each breath he felt his will to survive returning. He began to wonder if her species had built this adaptation because their world was harsher than his own, if they had always lived on the edge of survival, giving to one another when needed. The more he thought about it, the more he realized she was not only keeping him alive, she was teaching him something. Survival was not strength alone, it was sacrifice, trust, and dependence. He wondered if humans had forgotten that in their endless war. On the third waking, he found her struggling to sit upright. She pointed at her injured arm, then at him, as though asking for help. Carefully, he moved closer and braced her as she shifted her weight. She winced in pain, her teeth gritted, but together they managed to bind the arm with strips torn from his ruined uniform. She let out a sigh, leaning against him briefly before pulling away with quiet dignity. For the first time, he saw something like gratitude in her eyes. The fragile alliance was forming, built on hunger, pain, and the silent need to live another day. It was not friendship, not yet. But when the bunker shook again, and both of them pressed their backs to the wall, staring at the ceiling as dust rained down, he reached for her hand without thinking. She startled, but she did not pull away. For the first time since the war began, He felt he was not alone, and in that moment he knew this bond, as strange as it was, might be the only thing that could keep either of them alive. The human no longer counted hours inside the bunker because time had lost all meaning. The faint red glow of the emergency panel never changed, and without sun or stars, he could not tell if the world outside was day or night. What he could feel was the slow rhythm of his hunger, and the steady weakness that tried to pull him down whenever the alien girl closed her eyes too long. Each day, if it could be called a day, he found himself leaning closer to her, depending on what she gave him, and each time guilt clawed at his chest a little deeper. Her body grew weaker while his grew stronger. At first it was hard to notice, because she had been injured from the beginning, but after a while he saw her shoulders sag, her steps falter, her voice fade. He hated himself when he reached for her help again, hated the way his body craved what she offered, yet the truth was clear. Without her, he would already be lying cold on the concrete. She was paying the price for both of them, and he could not pretend otherwise. He tried to change it. He searched the broken walls again for food, dug through rubble with his bare hands until his fingers bled, hoping to find a scrap of ration hidden in the wreckage. All he uncovered was dust, twisted metal, and the faint smell of mold. He forced himself to sip the stale water he collected from the dripping ceiling, even though it burned his throat, but it was not enough. His stomach growled with rage and his hands trembled with weakness. In the end he had to turn back to her, ashamed, desperate, and afraid. She did not refuse him. She never once pulled away. Her strange bright eyes only softened when she saw his struggle, and though her body shook, she still gave. Sometimes after, she would lie still for long moments, breathing as though every breath hurt, and he would sit beside her, watching, begging silently that she would not slip away. He began to realize that her sacrifice was not endless. One day she might have nothing left to give, and that day would mean the end for both of them. The more they tried to speak, the more he learned small pieces of her. They named objects together, stumbling over each other's words, laughing without meaning to when the sound came out wrong. Once, she tapped her chest and spoke a word slowly. He guessed it was her name. He tried to say it, failing again and again until she covered her mouth with her good hand to hide her laughter. He repeated his own name after, and she tried as well, her accent twisting it into something new. That simple exchange made the air between them feel lighter, even inside the tomb of stone and steel. Yet trust was not simple. There were nights when he woke suddenly, convinced she might kill him while he slept, and he would grip a shard of metal he had found in the rubble, waiting in the dark, heart pounding. But she never moved against him. Instead, she would sometimes wake at the same time, staring into the shadows as if she feared him in the same way. Slowly, those nights grew fewer, until at last he realized he no longer kept the shard close. The fear had faded, replaced by something else, something harder to name. One cycle, the bunker shook more violently than before, and part of the ceiling cracked open with a sharp roar. Dust filled the air until they both coughed and choked, clutching each other blindly. When the sound settled, a thin shaft of light pierced the darkness for the first time. It was faint, weak, but it was sunlight, real and alive. He felt his chest tighten with hope, then with despair. The opening was far above, unreachable without tools or strength they did not have. Still, the light changed something inside him. The world outside was not gone. Life was still out there, waiting. He looked at her then, her face glowing faintly in the narrow beam. She was thinner now, her lips pale, her body trembling with each movement. He wanted to tell her he could not take from her again, that he would find another way, but when he opened his mouth, no words came. His voice cracked, his throat raw, and all he managed was a broken sound, yet she understood. She touched his hand gently and shook her head, as if telling him he could not stop now, not when his life still had weight, not when he could still walk if she could not. The human began to dream strange dreams when he slept. In them, he was back on the surface, standing on a battlefield where smoke rose in towers and fire burned across the horizon. In these dreams he always turned to find her beside him, not as an enemy but as a companion, her skin glowing like the stars. He would wake sweating, his body tense, unsure if the dream was a warning or a promise. The days of survival took their toll on his mind as much as his body. He grew restless, pacing the small space of the bunker, beating his fists against the walls in frustration. Sometimes he shouted at her even though she could not understand the words, his anger spilling out from fear and helplessness. She would only watch him quietly until he stopped, her silence cutting through his rage more deeply than any reply could. Then shame would wash over him, and he would crouch beside her, whispering apologies she could not hear. She would place her hand lightly on his arm, and that simple touch would calm him more than any words. One cycle when the air grew thin and their breaths turned shallow, the emergency panel flickered and nearly went dark. Panic rushed through him as he pressed his hands against the machine, begging it to keep running, but the lights dimmed to almost nothing. He turned back to her, ready to say they were doomed, only to see her watching him with calm eyes. She reached out, placed her hand over his heart, and whispered a word he did not know. He did not need to. The meaning was clear. Do not give up. That night he stayed awake beside her, watching her chest rise and fall, listening to the bunker creak like an old beast ready to die. He thought of the surface again, of his squad, of the war, and for the first time he wondered if winning mattered at all. What did victory mean if survival required this kind of sacrifice? What if the true strength of his kind was not in weapons or numbers, but in the fragile bond being formed in the dark? One act of trust at a time. The price of survival was high. He could feel it every time she grew weaker, every time he grew stronger. It was a balance that could not last forever. But as he watched her sleep, her hand still resting faintly against his arm, he made himself a promise. If anyone was to walk out of this bunker alive, it would not be only because she gave everything. He would find a way to give back, no matter what it cost. For the first time since the walls closed around them, he no longer thought only of himself. The bunker had become a coffin that breathed slower with each passing hour. The red light of the panel grew weaker, the air heavier, the silence sharper. The human could feel the pressure in his chest every time he tried to take a deep breath. His lungs ached as if the bunker itself was pressing down on him, trying to force him into the ground. The alien girl lay close to him, her body trembling with weakness, her skin losing its faint shimmer. She was still alive, but her strength was fading, and he knew it was because of him. He hated the way his body felt stronger while hers wasted away. He hated the way he depended on her more and more. Each time she gave, she looked smaller, thinner, her breaths shorter. He had promised himself he would find a way to give back, yet every attempt ended in failure. The rations were gone, the water scarce, the exit sealed. The only thing he could do was keep her warm, share what little comfort he could offer, and sit awake when she fell into uneasy sleep. But that was not enough. The crack in the ceiling where the shaft of sunlight came through mocked him. It was like a window to a world he could not reach. He stared at it often, imagining what lay beyond. Green fields, blue sky, or maybe nothing but fire and smoke. Still, it was a reminder that life continued outside. He could not die here. She could not die here. Something inside him began to burn, a will that had been hidden under despair. One cycle, when the bunker shook harder than ever, dust poured down in thick clouds, and the ground beneath them trembled as if it would collapse. The alien girl cried out softly, clutching her injured arm as the walls groaned. He pulled her close, shielding her body with his own as stones fell from above. When the shaking stopped, a new crack had appeared, this time along the door. He touched it with his fingers and felt a faint draft of air. His heart raced. The door was not sealed forever. He tried to force it open, pressing his shoulder against the heavy slab of metal until his muscles screamed. His hands slipped on the cold surface, his breath ragged, but the door did not move. He fell back, gasping, his throat burning. She was watching him again, her eyes dark with fear but also with something like hope. She gestured at the door, then at him, then shook her head. He understood. She was telling him it was too dangerous, that he would break himself before he broke the bunker. But he could not stop. He began to plan in silence, studying the cracks, gathering the sharp pieces of metal he had found earlier. He thought of using them as tools, prying at the edges, weakening the frame. Every hour he worked, even as his body begged for rest, even as she called softly to him. He could not give up. If they stayed, they would both die. If they escaped, maybe there was a chance. The more he worked, the more she weakened. She still gave to him, even when her lips trembled and her hands shook. He wanted to refuse, but she pushed him to take, her eyes fierce despite her frail body. It was as if she had decided his life was worth more than hers. That thought tore him apart. He could not accept that. He would not allow it. One night, if it was truly night, the filters gave their last breath. The red light flickered and died, plunging them into near darkness except for the thin beam of sunlight above. The air grew stale quickly, heavy with dust and smoke. He felt panic claw at him, and for the first time he saw fear break through her calm mask. She coughed hard, her body shaking, her breaths too shallow. He rushed to her side, holding her, whispering words she could not understand. She touched his face weakly and whispered her own word, her voice faint as a breeze. He did not know what it meant, but he felt the weight of it. It was a farewell, a command, a plea. He shook his head violently, refusing to accept it. He pressed her hand against his chest, showing her his heartbeat, strong and alive because of her. Then he pointed at the crack in the door, at the shaft of sunlight, at both of them together. His voice broke as he repeated her name over and over, until she closed her eyes and tears slipped down her cheeks. That was the breaking point. Human rose with a fire inside him that burned hotter than hunger, hotter than fear. He grabbed the shard of metal and drove it into the crack, prying with all his strength. His muscles tore, his skin split, his blood smeared across the steel, but he did not stop. The sound of grinding metal filled the bunker, echoing like thunder. Dust rained down again, the walls groaned, but he roared with effort, a sound that was not just human but primal, the cry of life refusing to die. The alien girl tried to reach him, but her body failed. She watched instead, her eyes wide with terror and hope, whispering his name again and again, as if willing him forward. He drove his shoulder against the door once more, pain exploding through his ribs, but this time the slab shifted. Only a fraction, but it moved. Air rushed in, cool and sharp, filling his lungs with new fire. He gasped, tears stinging his eyes. He turned to her, pointing, shouting her name. She smiled weakly, too weak to rise, but her eyes shone with light. He knew then that they could escape, but not together, not unless he carried her. His strength was returning, but hers was nearly gone. He crouched beside her, lifting her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, as if her body was already leaving this world behind. She clung weakly to his chest, her head resting against his shoulder. He whispered to her that he would not leave her, though she could not understand the words. The meaning was clear. The bunker groaned one last time, louder than before, and he knew the place was dying. It was now or never. With her in his arms, he pressed against the broken door again, forcing it wider, his body straining with the effort. The light grew brighter, spilling into the darkness, until at last there was enough space for them to crawl through. He staggered forward, the air of the outside brushing against his skin like the breath of a god. Behind him, the bunker trembled, ready to collapse. Ahead, he saw a world scarred by fire and smoke, but alive. The surface stretched before them, broken but real. He fell to his knees, clutching her close, both of them gasping in the open air. They had reached the edge of death, and yet they were still alive. The human woke from uneasy half-sleep with the weight of silence pressing on his chest, more than the stale air ever could, and for a moment, he thought the alien girl beside him had already gone. Her head, resting back, eyes half closed, her chest rising with the shallowest rhythm, barely a breath at all. He sat up too fast, his ribs hurting, but panic giving him the strength, and he whispered her name, though he had never been sure if he said it right. But the sound stirred her. She opened her eyes slowly, and a faint smile crossed her lips, though there was no energy behind it, only stubborn will. He touched her hand and it was cold, yet she gripped his fingers weakly, and he understood what she meant before she spoke, because she had told him before in broken words. Her species had lived through many dark places, and the last act of giving was never done with regret. Her body had been keeping him alive, but now it was nearly spent, and she could not keep this up. He shook his head, not wanting to hear it again, not wanting to see her fade while he grew stronger, but she spoke anyway in her halting voice, telling him that he must live because his kind still had a chance to change the course of the war, while her kind were already lost, scattered, hunted, only survivors hiding in corners of ruined worlds. He tried to argue. He told her they would find a way out together, that he would carry her if he had to, but she closed her eyes and whispered that her strength had already gone too far, and only he could break through now. The bunker walls had begun to shift with distant rumbling, as if the outside world was alive again, and maybe rescue was close, but maybe it was death digging its claws through the earth. He held her close, his throat tight, his body trembling, not from weakness anymore, but from the terrible knowledge that survival was no longer about himself, but about what he would do with the life she had given. The last of her strength came in the final act. She pulled him closer, her body shaking, and though she looked fragile, she forced herself to give again one final gift that left her almost limp in his arms. He wanted to refuse, but he could not. Her eyes begged him to take it, because if he refused, then her sacrifice would mean nothing. He let the warm taste of her life fill him, and his body surged with energy in a way it never had before. He hated himself and he loved her for it all at once. With sudden strength he rose and gathered what little remained of supplies, tying them into a bundle. He lifted her into his arms. She was light, as if already fading away, and he walked toward the hatch that had mocked him for days. His body felt stronger, now his breath fuller, and for the first time he had the power to try again. He set her down gently, leaning her against the wall, and pressed his hands to the cold metal of the hatch, his muscles straining until veins stood in his neck. The metal groaned but still resisted, so he slammed his shoulder again and again, sweat running into his eyes, teeth gritted, heart hammering with fury and grief. Finally, the lock gave with a cracking sound, and a rush of air poured in. It was thin air filled with dust and smoke, but it was freedom compared to the dying breath of the bunker. He turned back and scooped her into his arms, carrying her up the broken steps into the ruined light above. The world was shattered. Buildings twisted to skeletons, smoke rising from broken ground, the sky bruised with fire, yet it was still the world, and he had made it out. Staggered forward, calling with all the voice he had left, hoping anyone would hear, and at first there was only the echo of destruction, but then a faint sound answered, mechanical and growing louder. A rescue craft appeared, rising over the broken ridge, its lights cutting through the smoke. He shouted again, lifting his arm high, holding her closer with the other, and the craft descended. Hands pulled him in rough but strong voices shouted that they had thought no one had survived down here. They tried to take him alone, but he refused. He thrust her forward, his voice breaking, saying she had saved him, saying she was the reason he still breathed. They hesitated, fear flashing across their faces because she was alien, but the way he clung to her and the fire in his eyes made them step back. He told them if she was left behind, then they might as well leave him too, and they led her on, and the craft lifted from the ruins, carrying them away to safety. His body was shaking, now the borrowed strength finally fading, but he held her hand all the way, eyes locked on her fragile face. She was alive still, but barely, and he whispered that he would not let her sacrifice be forgotten. When they reached the base, he collapsed, but his words remained. He told the commanders and the medics that without her he would have died long ago. That every breath he had taken had been hers first. At first they did not believe him, but the truth could not be hidden. The way her body had weakened while his had strengthened, the evidence of his survival that made no sense without her. The story spread among the soldiers, and then further beyond the base. Humans had always seen her kind as enemies, but now there was proof that compassion had bridged a divide. No war had managed to cross. For the first time, talk of peace was not only whispers, but a possibility born from the bond of two trapped souls in a bunker, one human and one alien. Human never forgot the moment she looked at him with her last strength and gave him life. He carried that memory as a weapon sharper than any blade or gun. He carried it as a promise that survival is not only about who is strongest, but about who is willing to give when nothing is left. And so his survival became more than his own. It became a lesson passed through the camps and whispered in the ruined cities. Humanity had always believed their strength was their hope, but now they knew their true hope had come from the milk of an alien girl who gave everything so that one human might live and remind them that even in the darkest trap, survival is not about power, but about the bond between lives that refuse to let go. The end.